Hello, and welcome to today's presentation on Oklahoma abuse, neglect, and exploitation in long-term residential care. My name is Elizabeth, and I will be going through today's content with you. Today's objectives include identifying long-term resident rights against abuse, reviewing definitions, identifying examples of different forms of abuse, discussing the abuse, neglect, and exploitation reporting system, identifying who makes reports and who receives them, reviewing the Oklahoma Ombudsman Program, and reviewing the Oklahoma Adult Protective Services. Long-term care resident right. The long-term care resident is entitled to be free from mental and physical abuse, corporal punishment, involuntary seclusion, and from any physical or chemical restraints used for discipline or convenience of staff and not required to treat medical symptoms. Restraints may be authorized in writing by a physician for a specified period of time. The resident or the representative of the resident must be consulted, and residents have the right to refuse. Let's go over some definitions. Vulnerable adult is an individual who is incapacitated person or who, because of physical or mental disability, including persons with Alzheimer's disease or other dementias, incapacity, or other disability, is substantially impaired in the ability to provide adequately for the care or custody of himself or herself, or is unable to manage his or her property and financial affairs effectively, or to meet essential requirements for mental or physical health or safety, or to protect himself or herself from abuse, verbal abuse, neglect, or exploitation without assistance from others. Abuse, either causing or permitting it to occur, is the infliction of physical pain, injury, sexual abuse, sexual exploitation, unreasonable restraint or confinement, mental anguish, or personal degradation, or the deprivation of nutrition, clothing, shelter, health care, or other care or services without which serious physical or mental injury is likely to occur to a vulnerable adult by a caretaker or other person providing services to a vulnerable adult. Exploitation is an unjust or improper use of the resources of a vulnerable adult for the profit or advantage, pecuniary or otherwise, of a person other than the vulnerable adult through the use of undue influence, coercion, harassment, duress, deception, false representation, or false pretense. Financial neglect. Repeated instances by a caretaker or other person who has assumed the role of financial management of failure to use the resources available to restore or maintain the health and physical well-being of a vulnerable adult. Let's review some financial neglect examples. Squandering or negligently mismanaging the money, property, or accounts of a vulnerable adult, refusing to pay for necessities or utilities in a timely manner, providing substandard care to a vulnerable adult despite the availability of adequate financial resources, stealing from an elderly resident, cashing a resident's check without authorization or permission, forging a resident's signature, using a resident's credit cards, and coercing or deceiving a resident into signing a legal document. Sexual exploitation includes, but is not limited to, a caretaker's causing, allowing, permitting, or encouraging a vulnerable adult to engage in prostitution or in the lewd, obscene, or pornographic photographing, filming, or depiction of the vulnerable adult as those acts are defined by state law. Sexual assault and battery, rape, sodomy, coerced nudity, unwanted touching, sexually explicit photographing are all examples of sexual exploitation. Verbal abuse is the use of words, sounds, or other communication including, but not limited to, gestures, actions, or behaviors by a caretaker or other person providing services to a vulnerable adult that are likely to cause a reasonable person to experience humiliation, intimidation, fear, shame, or degradation. Let's look at some signs that an elderly person is suffering from abuse, neglect, and or exploitation. Physical signs. Many forms of nursing home abuse will leave visual cues. Be vigilant if the resident has unexplained bruises, scrapes, broken bones, poor hygiene, unsanitary conditions, dehydration or malnutrition, weight loss, untreated medical conditions, safety issues in their room or facility, repeated hospitalizations, and trips to different emergency rooms. Emotional signs. It can be tough to distinguish between abuse and some disease symptoms, but the resident will show emotional signs if they are victims. Some of those signs may include, but are not limited to, mood swings or dramatic changes in personality, depression, fear of staff members, extreme withdrawal or self-isolation, loss of appetite, and frequent agitation. Financial signs. Often the financial or material signs are the easiest to uncover when one knows what to look for. Beware of unexplained withdrawals of money from accounts, unpaid bills, a pattern of missing valuables, abrupt changes in a will or other legal documents, new names being added to a bank or investment account. We will now talk about reporting abuse, neglect, and exploitation. When exactly is a report of abuse, neglect, or exploitation required? As soon as there is awareness of abuse, neglect, or exploitation of a resident of a facility, reasonable cause to believe that a vulnerable adult is suffering from abuse, neglect, or exploitation, a report must be made as soon as the reporter is aware of the situation and can be oral or in writing. If the report is not made writing in the first instance, as soon as possible after it is initially made by telephone or otherwise, the report shall be reduced to writing to the Department of Human Services. An employee or agent of a facility who becomes aware of abuse, neglect, or exploitation of a resident prohibited by the Nursing Home Care Act shall immediately report the matter to the facility administrator. A facility administrator who becomes aware of abuse, neglect, or exploitation of a resident shall immediately act to rectify the problem and shall make a report of the incident and its correction to the Department of Health. The facility is responsible for reporting the following serious incidents to the Department of Health within 24 hours: communicable diseases, deaths by unusual occurrence, including accidental deaths or deaths other than by natural causes, and deaths that may be attributed to a medical device, missing residents, also to local law enforcement agencies within 2 hours, situations arising where rape or a criminal act is suspected, also to local law enforcement immediately, and resident abuse, neglect, and misappropriation of the property of a resident. All initial written reports of incidents or situations shall be mailed to the Department of Health within 5 working days after the incident or situation. Who makes a report? Any person can report suspected abuse, neglect, or exploitation. However, persons required to make reports shall include, but not be limited to, physicians, operators of emergency response vehicles and other medical professionals, social workers and mental health professionals, law enforcement officials, staff of domestic violence programs, long-term care facility personnel, including staff of nursing facilities, intermediate care facilities for individuals with intellectual disabilities, assisted living facilities, and residential care facilities, other health care professionals, persons entering into transactions with a caretaker or other person who has assumed the role of financial management for a vulnerable adult, staff of residential care facilities, group homes, or employment settings for individuals with intellectual disabilities, job coaches, community service workers, and personal care assistants, municipal employees. Filing a report against a nursing home in Oklahoma. Long-term care services oversees the health and safety of residents living in licensed long-term care facilities, nursing homes, residential care homes, assisted living centers, etc. File a complaint with the long-term care by sending an email to the address on the screen or by calling the phone number on the screen. There is protection for reporters. Any person participating in good faith and exercising due care in the making of a report shall have immunity from any civil or criminal liability that might otherwise be incurred or imposed. Any such participation shall have the same immunity with respect to participation in any judicial proceeding resulting from the report. No employer shall terminate the employment, prevent or impair the practice or occupation of, or impose any other sanction on an employee solely for the reason that the employee made or caused to be made a report. What information is included in the report? The name and address of the vulnerable adult, the name and address of the caretaker, if any, a description of the current location of the vulnerable adult, a description of the current condition of the vulnerable adult, a description of the situation which may constitute abuse, neglect, or exploitation of the vulnerable adult, if federal law specifically prohibits the disclosure of any of the information required by this subsection, that information may be excluded from the report. There are penalties for failing to report. Knowingly and willfully failing to promptly report is a misdemeanor punishable by a fine of up to $1,000 or imprisonment of up to 1 year or both. There's also a penalty for making a false report. Any person who willfully or recklessly makes a false report shall be civilly liable for any actual damages suffered by the person being reported and for any punitive damages set by the court or jury which may be allowed in the discretion of the court or jury. Who receives these reports? The Department of Human Services, the Office of the District Attorney in the county which the suspected abuse, neglect, or exploitation occurred, the local municipal police department or sheriff's department, and the Oklahoma Long-Term Care Ombudsman. The state of Oklahoma has many resources for long-term care residents. Let's review two major programs for these residents. The Oklahoma Long-Term Care Ombudsman. What do they do? An ombudsman assists in obtaining information on nursing homes, resolving problems between nursing homes and residents or their families, serve residents in Oklahoma's long-term care facilities, including nursing homes, assisted living facilities, and similar adult care homes, and an ombudsman helps improve the quality of life and the quality of care available to long-term care facility residents. Adult Protective Services assist adults who need help taking care of themselves and who may be experiencing maltreatment. APS specialists help connect vulnerable adults to the services they need to stay safely in their homes and communities whenever possible. This concludes our presentation. Thank you for your participation.